I'm John Sipher.
And I'm Jerry O'Shea.
Between us, we have over 60 years of experience as clandestine officers in the CIA, serving in high-risk areas all around the world.
Part of our job was creating conspiracies, like being undercover, to deceive our adversaries.
Now, we're going to use that experience to investigate the conspiracy theories everyone's talking about, as well as some you may not have heard.
Could these be true, or are we being manipulated?
Find out now on Mission Implausible. Today's guest is Peter Strzok. He's a former Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, and he led the investigation into the Russian interference in the 2016 United States elections, as well as the investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email server. He's now an author, writer, speaker, and podcaster who hosts the popular podcast Clean Up on Aisle 45, and he's a good friend of ours. Welcome, Peter.
Hey, John. Hey, Jerry. Great to be with you.
So Peter, I'll get right into it. One of our recent guests believes there is evidence that Donald Trump engaged in a relationship with Russian intelligence in the 1980s and since the 1980s. He bases it on the timing of his trips to Russia and Trump's subsequent actions at the time. Can you explain what this would mean to professional investigators, if anything? Are there circumstances where an individual would be investigated on these kind of issues, and what would it take for that kind of investigation to start?
Yeah, well, short answer is I think that's probably a reach. I mean, look, what's important to remember is, the FBI is both, it's interesting and unique in some ways in that it's both a member of the U.S. intelligence community. At the same time, it's a criminal law enforcement entity and conducts investigations into violations of law and everything that your listeners may be familiar with, whether it's looking at, a bank robbery or organized crime. The FBI goes out and investigates that, and they also investigate national security crime. So if somebody is committing the crime of espionage, somebody like Robert Hansen at the FBI or Aldrich James at the CIA, those are crimes, right? And they get investigated, and the Bureau collects evidence and is prepared to take that to a judge and lay out probable cause that a crime's been broken, and they can get search warrants and arrest warrants, and they put somebody to trial. And most folks, when they think about the FBI, think about its criminal authorities and taking people to trial and putting them in jail. But what's interesting for the FBI, at least, and part of what I found so fascinating working there is it's also an intelligence organization, right? It is the lead counterintelligence agency in the United States. And what that means for your listeners is far beyond just looking at an allegation of a violation of crime, it's also charged with responding to all these nations around the world that are doing intelligence activities within the United States. So just as the CIA operates abroad in Russia, China, all around the world, Russia and China and Iran and most of our allies are doing the same thing within the United States. And so when it comes to Russia, say, conducting intelligence activities in the United States, it's the FBI's job to respond to that. And that isn't, most of the time, in the context of a criminal investigation. Most of the time, it's looking there and trying to understand not so much what a U.S. person is doing, but what that foreign nation is doing, right? So the government of Russia has strategic interests, and they inform and advance those interests by, in part, engaging in intelligence collection, same thing as we do. And so when the government of Russia, when Vladimir Putin, when the presidential authority says we need or want to do these things, they will leverage and call on all their intel agencies, and in the old days, this is, you both know very well, and that was the KGB, which then spun off to the SVR, which is Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the GRU, Russia's Military Intelligence Service, the FSB, which is a huge both domestic security service, and they do signals intelligence now as well. But all of these things, when they come to operate in the United States, the FBI tries, working with the rest of the intelligence community, tries to understand what they're doing and prevent that, make it harder for them to do that, and, if we're good at it, sort of manipulate that. And a lot of times, in most cases, counterintelligence investigations are not opened at all to prove that somebody did something. They're opened up to understand what it is that these foreign governments are doing within the United States. And in many cases, complete hypothetical, somebody in the Russian embassy who the U.S. government suspects to be an SVR officer under official cover, right? They're working in the embassy, stationed as a diplomat undercover Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Again, this is completely hypothetical. We see through our investigations of that person that they are striking up a friendship with somebody who happens to be say, a mid-level diplomat at the Department of State. And so the FBI will open a case to understand what that contact is, not necessarily because that Department of State employee did anything wrong, but it's just to gather information to understand, one, what the Russians are doing, and two, kind of exclude, what this person is doing anything wrong or not. So going to your original question, it is not at all surprising. Indeed, the Russians would be negligent. Soviets before them would have been negligent to not go out and try and look at and understand as much as they could movers and shakers in America, whether those are politicians, whether those are people in the government, whether those are prominent businessmen. And so would it surprise me at all if Donald Trump is a businessman in the 70s and the 80s, traveled to Moscow, or had Soviet and Russian businessmen or private citizens coming in and wanting to invest in his real estate or casinos or anywhere else? Wouldn't surprise me at all. Would the Russians try and look at that information that they obtained to say, hey, who is this person? How can we leverage him now? Or even 10, 20, 30 years in the future, because they, as well, if not better than the U.S. does, will play the long game, right? I mean, they can look at somebody now and just file whatever they find information-wise, file that away, because maybe in 10 years that person is suddenly a prominent real estate mogul. Maybe in 20 years that person's the president of the United States. But just because somebody is there in Moscow, somebody is there dealing with people who have either direct or indirect contacts with Russian intelligence, doesn't make them, they're a source, right? They're in bed with the Russians. It doesn't work that way in my experience.
Yeah, it's often not a binary thing. I think it's important for people to realize that they think that you're either a spy or you're not, right? There's a big spectrum in between. And on the long game, I want to just emphasize that and get your take that this is something that the Russians have been doing for a long time. There's this famous story from 1968 that Hubert Humphrey was running for president, and he and Johnson were not getting along. Humphrey had a much softer line on Vietnam, and the Humphrey campaign was really low on money because Johnson wasn't getting the Democratic donors, big donors, to contribute to his campaign. And the KGB then asked Soviet ambassador to the U.S., Dobrynin, to have breakfast with Humphrey. And he offered Humphrey money for his campaign and a way to get the money to Humphrey without it being obviously from the Soviet Union. Humphrey turned him down flat. And one of the reasons for that, Humphrey said later, and Dobrynin said he felt awkward asking him or making the offer, was that he knew that once he took the money, like, it's not as though he was their spy, but they would have leverage on him for the rest of his life and on the party. And so this isn't something that they would just look at Donald Trump in the 70s or 80s. This is something that goes back, almost as far as you can think. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and a couple of takeaways from that. One is that you're absolutely right. I mean, the recruited agent, the recruited source on whichever side, the person who is sitting there, they know they were working for a foreign intelligence service. They are engaged in clandestine intelligence collection. They're using covert communications to respond to the tasking and receive that tasking. They're getting paid clandestinely. That is, in my experience, the tiny small number of percentage of people that you get information from, either collectors, foreign collectors, Russians, Chinese here in the United States. The number of people they have actually working in that context are tiny compared to the number of people who are agents of influence, who have mental red lines or fig leaves that they want to maintain, or, Jerry, to your point, they don't want to take money because they feel if they do that, they'd be exposed to coercion, and they want to be able to say they never took it even though they're doing favors. That's the huge middle of intelligence collection. And you two are the experts on the way that the agency does business abroad, but, whether it was looking at what the Russians or Chinese are doing, whether it was recruiting sources within the U.S. to help the FBI, most of the people are willing to do things in the margins is the wrong way to think about it, but they're willing to do things short of, hey, I want you to be an on-the-books asset, and, we're going to give you a code name, and, again, want you to behave in all these very specific ways that you have to do if you're going to, operate at that level. And for the Russians, that's true, too. And the second point to your example, Jerry, is like, our political system in so many ways relies on people having the good sense and, also a sense of morality to say, I'm not going to take this money because it would expose me to coercion and it would look bad. When you look at Donald Trump, that's one of the concerning things is there's no apparent compunction to not take that money. I mean, his statements about, towards the end of his administration, well, if she offered me oppo on Biden, I'd probably take it, or at least I'd look at it before I'd consider telling the FBI. There's this recent reporting, again, without saying whether it's true or not, from Carol Leonnig at the Washington Post, that there was this alleged payment of $10 million from the government of Egypt to Trump. Again, we don't know if that's true or not, and nobody in the media seems to be able to actually ask that question of Donald Trump when they have him to question him. But yeah, I'm not getting my hopes up. But those sort of traditional ways in which intelligence services seek to exploit people to gain leverage short of formal recruitment, that's the area where, as a counterintelligence guy, when you look at Trump, he's extraordinarily susceptible to that. And that susceptibility, one, implies it could happen and does happen, and I think has happened. But two, it also doesn't mean the guy's like a formal, everybody's like, oh, he met Putin and he got his tasking for the next quarter. And he didn't get his fucking next tasking for the next quarter. They were just talking and Putin was playing him like he's played him the entire time through. And it wasn't like a little card or a one-time pad where he could, use that to decrypt what the 17 documents were they wanted from Trump.
Can you imagine Trump trying to decrypt at one time?
Oh my God, no, fuck no. Can you imagine sitting there and doing the math and spilling trying to raise the no, that would be if you want to do a Intel sitcom, that would be like Donald Trump, recruited agent. Can you imagine him trying to clear a dead drop to go and remember how to mark drop loaded or drop unloaded? That would be high. That would be hijinks.
We didn't know.
Hijinks.
Well, there was a corrupt politician who was taking money for the Egyptians for political favors, but it wasn't Donald Trump. It was Senator Menendez, right? And his sin was that he got the money in gold bars and $100 bills that he stuck in his freezer, right? If he'd been a little smarter on how he did it, he might not have gone to jail, right? So,
yeah, Jerry, how could that be? Because we've all been told the Department of Justice and FBI have been weaponized about the Republicans.
I know.
How could it be that a Democratic,
it's not like you're going to indict
Democratic politician,
mayor of New York or anything?
No, right? Yes, but again, the interesting thing there, I mean, there are a lot of interesting things, but one is that, it's not just the traditional bad guys who engage in intelligence collection. And it's really interesting, too, when you combine it with the example of, pretty strong indications that the government of India was hiring a variety of people to assassinate rivals, domestic Indian rivals within Canada and potentially in the United States. If you look at India and Egypt, both ostensibly U.S. allies, both developing nations, their political calculus that, hey, we're willing to go into the U.S. and Western political environment, throw a lot of money around, engage in lethal activity in the case of India, that's a really interesting sort of insight into how, in my mind, both Egypt and India and Turkey, I mean, think about Turkey in this context too, how they weigh risk to their relationship with the United States against how they view their own goals. And it isn't, I don't think the U.S. is probably not as powerful as we like to think we are in some
I don't know. I think we've got some really good friends. It's not like Israel would ever spy on us, right?
No, of course not.
Oops.
So, Peter, let me ask you a question. Was the Mueller investigation a CI investigation, a counterintelligence investigation? And how would it have been different if it were? Because I think I know the answer.
Yeah, so the answer is no. And one of the frustrating and confounding things is that we, the FBI, after Director Comey was fired, a case was opened on Trump. So one, the takeaway is there was not some case on Trump going back to the summer of 2016. That case on Trump was not opened until whenever that was, spring is 2017. And it was a twofold opening, right? One was, did he engage in the crime of obstruction by firing Comey? And there's a criminal statute that lays out the elements of the crime of obstruction. It would be just a traditional criminal investigation. But there was a second component of that case, which was a counterintelligence case about Trump, which was designed to sit there and ask those questions that I talked about earlier about, what is Russia trying to do? What has Russia done with Trump in the past? What have they been targeting him for recruitment? What sort of things might they have done towards that end? What sort of things had Trump done? Was he witting of it, not witting of it? What along the path of, the Russians gathering
One
intelligence
quick
and trying
question,
to
Peter.
coerce him?
Was that
Yeah.
the CIA investigation was open? Was that an investigation of Trump or of the campaign?
That was Trump. There was never
Okay.
an investigation of the campaign. Now, another lie, right, that you'll hear out of the far right. There was never ever, to the point, I was at least, when I left the Bureau in 2018 in the middle, there was never an investigation of the campaign. We don't investigate campaigns. That was, there was a initial investigation about whether the Russians had made an offer of assistance to release stolen emails to help Trump. And the question there was who they made that offer to, if they made it. And then with Trump, it was, that counterintelligence investigation. But what Mueller was, his appointment order is very narrow and very specific. It is to investigate and prosecute an enumerated set of federal crimes. There's nothing about counterintelligence in there. And so, one, the special counsel statute, two, the parameters of what Trump was allowed to do are contained in that appointment order, and that is all criminal in nature, all criminal investigations. And what is frustrating to me is, I talked with Andy McCabe, who was the acting director of the FBI at the time, and said, okay, in addition to going and working with Mueller, with agents and investigators to investigate those crimes, at the same time, the FBI contingent was going to do this counterintelligence investigation, however hard or it would have been long and convoluted and probably one of the biggest counterintelligence investigations in the FBI's history, but we would do that. And recognizing that Mueller couldn't and didn't want to and didn't have the authority to do it, but the only place where all that sort of information came together was sitting there in the special counsel's office. And then when I was removed, to my surprise, and from what I've read Andy McCabe saying, his surprise, that never continued. It essentially stopped. And whether that was by choice, whether it was because the people that came after me didn't understand the sort of scope of what was supposed to be done, it didn't occur. And I think that is to the FBI's discredit, to the harm of the nation, that, again, when you look at whose job is it to take the lead on counterintelligence within the United States, well, it's the FBI's, and that nobody has ever looked at the very, I think, reasonable question of counterintelligence concerns surrounding Trump is a problem, is a gap, is a failure. And we haven't done it. And frankly, I don't think at this point in our history we're ever going to do it, because my suspicion is if he's elected, never going to happen. If he's not elected, people are going to, he's an old man. He's, at least 4 years later down the line, just let it go, because it is also hard to do, right? With somebody like Trump, that's an extraordinarily daunting prospect. So the short takeaway from that is this person, where it's been demonstrated, has extraordinary counterintelligence concerns around him, will never, ever be subjected to a professional counterintelligence investigation to try and understand it.
This for the audience, I want to just give one example. And then, Peter, I was wondering if you could comment on this example, both from a counterintelligence point of view and from a law enforcement point of view. So in 2008, and this is something that Trump talks about, it's a fact. In 2008, he sold a 6-acre Palm Beach piece of real estate to a Russian billionaire, Dmitry Rybolovlev. I got the name wrong, Rybolovlev. And he bought, Trump initially bought the real estate for $40 million. Now, Rybolovlev is very close to Putin. He's a Russian oligarch. And he bought it several years later in 2008, when the market was bad for real estate. He bought it for $100 million. So it's a $60 million, increase in the price of the real estate, which my understanding was only sort of ephemerally fixed up and renovated. So from a counterintelligence point of view, was this a way to funnel money into Donald Trump? Question. It's just a suspicion. And from a law enforcement point of view, is that anything illegal? So for the audience, you can see, like, okay, this is influence, this is money. So how would you view that that transaction from both of those optics?
Well, again, Jay, that's a great question, because the sort of evil glory of Trump is that his overlay of vulnerabilities from a counterintelligence perspective sort of overlay with the shadiness of a lot of his, in my opinion, business empire. And what you talked about, that business, like real estate is famously, or maybe not famously, real estate is well suited for corrupt actors to take advantage of for
Oh,
very
yeah.
specific
Laundering
reasons and
money. Yeah,
ways
sure.
that you pointed out, right? False valuations. On the one hand, you can have false valuations to evade taxes, which Trump has been, convicted of in New York. But it's also done, you can hide valuations that way. The other thing that's been done is that you can either inflate or deflate costs to engage in a transaction. And the example you gave, both parties knew that the property was not worth what it eventually sold for, but they ultimately agreed to sell it at that price, because it's hard to, show that it wasn't in fact worth that there was a buyer's premium, that they felt it was worth that. And how do you prove that in a court to show it's illegal is very, very
And it
difficult. So whether,
buys you
and
leverage,
that
buys you
comes up
influence. Sure.
in two contexts, right? One could be, this is absolutely a payment for influence. It's a payment for an action to be taken that's already been taken. The other thing where it comes up in real estate all the time is to launder money, right? If you have illicit money, whether you're an oligarch, whether you're a drug dealer, one of the ways that you take these illicit monies that you've gotten and turn them into legitimate, tangible things of value is to buy real estate. And that's why it's concerning when, I think it was Eric Trump, not Donald, I think it was Eric, who said at some point in the 2016 campaign, a disproportionate amount of the Trump's real estate holdings were from Russian entities. Well, that's an alarm bell, right? Because one, Russians may be trying to buy real estate because they want to park value in the West, but two, they could be laundering monies through there. And if you look at Trump, it's like his entire career, in my opinion, has been doing that. It's real estate, but it's also, look at his casinos. Another amazing way for laundering monies that are, ill-gotten gains, that you go and you buy chips and then, maybe you lose 10%, but when you cash out, you can take illegal monies and make them more legal. So Trump has spent his entire business career in and around business that is well suited to illicit movements of money. And one of his casinos, if I remember correctly, got in trouble. I think it was one in New Jersey, the Atlantic City, because they failed to do sufficient know your customer type checks. When somebody rolled in with a bunch of money, their state and other licensing entities require you as a casino to go out and do a certain amount of due diligence to make sure that these are legal monies. And if I recall correctly, his casino, at least one of them, was written up for not doing that sufficiently. So he's got a history of this. On the one hand, it serves him, in my opinion, well in shady business dealings, but it also serves him in a making himself vulnerable for in a intelligence context.
So, Peter, would you have, now this is a totally speculative question, and bear with me because I'm going to put out my view. Do you have a theory of the case on Trump vis-a-vis compromise with the Russians? And let me just put out my case around the 2016 election is that Donald Trump's lifestyle and business practices made him uniquely vulnerable to blackmail and extortion by the country that is unarguably the best in the world at those dark arts. His campaign team, with its own unusual shady ties to Russia, was willing to work with a hostile foreign power and eager to accept material stolen from Americans. None of them went to the authorities to report the illicit contacts, and many of them were subsequently arrested. When the issue of Russian involvement surfaced publicly, every single one of them lied and covered up their actions. Trump then attacked the very institutions and people, you one of them, that could hold him on account and sought to obstruct investigations, eventually then pardoning anyone who could provide evidence of wrongdoing. And then even after all of that, even his most fervent supporters have been unable to provide any innocent explanation why a domestic political campaign would need such deep engagement with a hostile foreign power. To me, I mean, that is very damning and suggests that there should be a counterintelligence investigation around the 2016 election and Trump, if nothing else.
Yeah, his campaign manager, Manafort, admits publicly in his book that he was meeting with a Russian intelligence officer and passing him information from the campaign that the Russians could then use to manipulate our election.
So how would you look at Trump in the counterintelligence sense?
I'd look at Trump as a grave counterintelligence threat. I mean, everything, John, that you pointed out. I mean, there is so much. Intelligence agencies, typically, certainly when you look at the Russians, are competent, right? Broadly, they are going to play somebody with a view towards the long game. They're not going to push an issue to cause that person to turn away or put them in a position where it's going to make them not want to do something. So what I mean by that is, if you're Russia and you are well versed in the ways to identify vulnerabilities in people, and again, it isn't just you and the three of us sitting around having a beer and shooting the shit about how somebody might be vulnerable. I mean, it's like the agency, like any intel service. You have teams of people who are sitting there through a formal process, looking at somebody to identify their vulnerabilities, to evaluate their psychology and what makes them tick, and to go out there and leverage that. I mean, some of that is gut sense as a case officer, but a lot of it is backed up by a huge organization, well-resourced, that's looking into it. And when you look at Trump, I mean, the things that motivate Trump are his ego, his insecurity, his affection and love of authoritarian figures, you know, and the psychologists can figure out if that's like a daddy issue when he was little, and money. And all of those are things that the Russian intelligence services are extraordinarily competent at exploiting. And so whether it's the things that Putin says to massage Trump's ego when they're talking, or statements Putin makes publicly, whether it is the thing to funnel money. And again, this isn't and would never be the SVR showing up at some, you know, sidebar between Putin and Trump and, you know, handing him over a bag of money or a wallet full of Bitcoin. It's going to be ways that are explainable, that are hard to trace. And so, you know, to your point, during the 2016 election, Michael Cohen was convicted and went to jail, was literally in and around Moscow dealing with Russian folks about the prospect of a Trump Tower in Moscow. Literally at the moment, Trump was on the campaign trail saying, I have no financial ties to Russia. None, which is obvious bullshit. And Trump knew that Cohen was dealing with Moscow at the moment he said that. And of course, the Russians knew that Michael Cohen was dealing them. So the minute that happens, the Russians are like, wait a minute, Trump denied it and we're doing it. So therefore, we've got this ongoing back and forth that gives us leverage, because Trump just denied it. And if we go there and publicize it, it's going to hurt him politically. Trump knows they know that. And so it's this unspoken agreement between those two parties that, you know, wink and a nod, this is fine, it's going to go on, and we're not going to talk about it. And repeat that, you know, across the board. And it again, the concern is it wasn't just from what's been publicly reported, it is, I think, a fair assumption to believe that while that was certainly going on with Russia, it wasn't limited to Russia. And when you're talking about somebody who's the, you know, candidate for the president of the United States, when they have all these vulnerabilities to foreign, not just foreign entities, but hostile foreign powers, it's an extraordinary vulnerability. And again, it's not just, I always looked at, you know, trying to get somebody to work with us, and I, again, don't want to speak for you, but you've got a toolkit of how to persuade a potential human source to work with you. And, you know, you've got different tools may work with different people. But with Trump, it's like every fucking tool in the toolbox works on him. You just dig your hand in there. Maybe you get a wrench, maybe you get a screwdriver, maybe you get a hammer. They all fucking work with Trump. Because whether it's money, whether it's his ego, whether it's, he is, you know, women. And again, look at Trump's sexual history. Look at what's been proven with E. Jean Carroll. Look at what's been alleged by these scores of women in the U.S. You can't tell me, knowing what you know and the way Russians are willing to use compromise and women to target Westerners, in your experience, what you saw happening in Russia, that they don't have the ability to, one, understand that appetite in Trump, and two, apply that. It's ridiculous. But again, he is the man with, his vulnerabilities are an open book, and the Russians are too damn good not to be leveraging that.
The movie The Godfather, you know, when we talk about this, comes to mind. With The Godfather being Putin or the Russian intelligence services, it's not as though the people who in the movie, or, you know, in reality with the mafioso, it's not as though they were their agents in that, you know, they had a card carrying thing, but they owed influence, right? They had the Godfather was, he had, you know, he had patrons, people who owed him favors, people who had to do things, and he was able to influence the judges and the police and the, you know, and the people in the movie. And so, you know, when I think of Trump and others that the Russians have brought into their ambit, it's people should think about, I think, more in that way. And Peter, you've got also experience in organized crime. I was sort of wondering if you could make a compare and contrast from high school sort of thing on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And the first thing that pops into mind is Michael Cohen talking about Trump and that he operates as a mob boss would, right? You don't write something that you can say, and you don't say anything that you can achieve with just a nod. And that Trump would never, again, thinking about Michael Cohen, he's describing, your favorite organized crime movie, that he would make it known what he wanted. He did not have to say specifically what he wanted done because everybody understood what it was. And there was this entire, the construct of the influence structure, things I'm doing for you, things you will do for me back, was largely unstated. And again, that evil overlay of Trump's skills with, in this case, intelligence and the counterintelligence world is Trump grew up, again, construction in New York. You cannot operate in construction or real estate in New York without bumping into organized crime in some way, shape, or form. And Trump has stated, and I think Sammy the Bull talks about seeing him in court or having some interaction. But again, if you're Trump, if you're dealing with unions, you're not going to be able to work in that. If you're dealing with casinos, you are not going to be able to operate in an environment without coming into contact and having at least some sort of agreement structure with organized crime. And you see that in the way Trump behaves. You see it in the way that he exercised his authority in the presidency. He might have said, I want these two people investigated, and I've been on the receiving end of that. But for a huge portion of what Trump wanted done, he didn't have to name people. People understood that. And so when you look at what makes it hard then, moving away from the intelligence side to the crime side, it's like, oh, well, why couldn't you prove Trump did all these crimes? It's like, well, because it's much like organized criminals. They don't sit there and say, John, I'm going to give Jerry this bag of cash, and in exchange, I need you to rob these two trucks coming down I-95 that have a bunch of things. You don't say that. You don't put that in writing. And so from an investigative on the criminal side, the same things that make it hard to work a case on a mafia crime family, moving it up the chain to get to the underboss, to get to the consigliere, to get to the don, to get to the chief. It's the same thing with Trump. You can't, like Michael Cohen testifying, one, he's already got credibility issues because of his own lying. But to sit there and say, well, no, we all just kind of understood what Trump wanted. That's 100% true, in my opinion. But if you're a jury who has to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, and you've got a talented defense attorney saying, well, Trump never said that. This man, Michael Cohen, might intimate or might believe that's what he wanted, but he never was told that. And if you're a juror and you only need one juror, right? Jury has to be unanimous. So if you only need one juror saying, that's kind of a reasonable doubt, it makes it really hard to prove a case. And again, makes it really hard when the American electorate decides to select somebody like this to be their president. It makes it very hard to hold them criminally accountable. And now, thanks to the Supreme Court, it's just become about 100 times harder. But that's a topic for another discussion.
Yeah, exactly. When Donald Trump pushes back against this stuff, he always says, Russia, Russia, Russia. And you said something which I thought was really interesting. You said that, these kind of things, this gangster mentality doesn't just work with Russia and Russian intelligence. It could work with others. And Jerry brought up earlier, and you talked about earlier, the thing with Egypt potentially providing $10 million to the campaign and to him. And surprisingly, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but Christopher Steele, the author of the famous Steele dossier, the former British intelligence officer, in the Washington Post today, there was a book review of his new book. So I guess I'll have to at some point read that. But people forget about the dossier, if you will. It's a silly word, but his reports. It was all about Trump and Russia. People remember the P tapes, all these other kind of things. But what people forget about that is what I think he meant when he wrote up those things. It said a lot of the Russia stuff was essentially a cover for a much bigger worrying counterintelligence issue, which was China. And so, but no one ever actually dug in, looked into China. And it seems to be, if you look into Trump's experience and his family and money coming from China, that there's as much a concern with China and perhaps Egypt or others as there would be with Russia.
Yeah, I think the issue with Trump is twofold. One is his willingness to cozy up to anybody that will provide him remuneration of some way, shape, or form. I mean, you look at Jared Kushner after the administration, who got what, like some more than $1 to $2 billion of investment money from the Saudi
And within
Sovereign
weeks.
Wealth Fund and others within weeks, and has turned, at least according to recent reporting, like hasn't turned a profit and has made $200 million, I forget the exact amount, in fees for managing that money for zero return for their investors. And that fund, which the president's daughter and, her, actually not she, but her, husband, son-in-law, the former president, has little to nothing to show for it, has no competence in it. The Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund advisors were saying, don't put your money here because it doesn't make sense financially from a risk perspective. But nonetheless, that money is flowing in there. There are other countries. We talked about Turkey earlier, or Egypt earlier. There's some, I think the Qataris, there's some indication that they're making licensing deals with Trump for a high rise. Not that he's building just to put his name on it, but anytime you get countries who are willing to pay tribute through some, legally coverable way, Trump is going to take it. And then the other thing, of course, is this odd, like he does have a fascination with strongmen. He does love, he talks about Kim Jong-un, and not just this stupid, he wrote me love letters, but comments he made to White House staff about, or maybe it was to Hannity or right-wing media personality, when Kim Jong-un talks, his people snap to attention. And Trump sees that as something he wants emulated, right? He wants his people, he wants, whether that's his government or the U.S. population, to snap to attention and have big parades and cry hysterically singing his praises on the evening news. There's a personal power fascination there, which is different from the financial one, but also doesn't bode well for American democracy. But you're right, it's not just Russia. And demonstrably, we've seen that. It is any number of nations. And again, Russia is very good at it, but China's no slouches either. Middle East, you want to talk about, governments that drive tough, shrewd bargains. Look at the Saudis, look at the Emiratis, look at the Qatari. They're very, very good at that. The Turks, they're excellent as well. And Trump is the mark in the bazaar. He is the guy that walks in and everybody's like, there's the sucker that we are going to get $10,000 for this $200 carpet. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. And whether he's going to the Egyptian souk, whether he's going to the Turkish dealer, whether he's going to the Chinese market, everybody sees him when he walks in, and he is the fucking mark. And he will be again.
One of the problems I see is that intelligence professionals, the people involved in counterintelligence, see the evidence and realize that Donald Trump and people like him are counterintelligence threats because they are, as you put it, easy marks. The wider audience in the U.S., either it's very difficult to follow this sort of evidence, to sort of understand it, and they hark back to, well, was he convicted in a court of law? And is there a smoking gun? And of course, Trump was convicted in several courts of law and trials prevented from going to court. But yeah, I'm sort of at a loss as to how to bring across to a wider audience, like the threat here, even if it's only, be generous, 5%, 10%, that the president of the United States has been somehow compromised. And I would come back to his own head of his national security advisor, McMaster, in his book, said to his wife, the Russians have got something on Trump. I just don't know what it is. And so this is, again, not a smoking gun, but this is a guy who worked very closely with Trump. I just wondered, Peter, if you could sort of
just to add to that, even without a conviction, the stakes of a counterintelligence investigation can be actually much higher and much more dangerous.
Right. Yeah. We wouldn't hire him in the CIA with his background, by the way.
No, nowhere. Well, you wouldn't, and that's like nobody would hire. You wouldn't hire him into McDonald's with his background.
That's true.
So I've struggled with that question because the issue, of course, is that and again, you're talking about John about Steele in his book, the inability of the American media to take any nuanced piece of information and examine the nuance. It has to be on the intel side. It's like, oh my God, the guy's a spy, and it's like, well, when you say spy, you don't really know what you're saying when you say that, but the assumption is there has to be the P tape, and he is getting his secret tasking, and it's not, and to expect anybody in the media to try and dive into the nuance of what it looks like to have a counterintelligence vulnerability and explain that in a tweet or in, you go on a,
Yeah,
cable news show and you
right.
got 2 40-second blocks to make that argument is really hard. And so I've kind of almost, other than like podcasts or writing a book, I've almost tried to like given up on that and focusing instead on like, look, this is yet another example of how Trump is unable to put the country's interests ahead of himself. And so, whether it is a willingness to sell out to the Russians or the Saudis, whether it is an inability to go to Arlington National Cemetery and not take advantage of that profoundly respectful setting and choosing instead to shove around staff and make a campaign video, whether it's talking about the military suckers and losers, whether it is denigrating any part of American governance and society that we hold sacred, this is yet another example of Trump's um, lack of suitability to be anywhere near the presidency. And so, is that I don't know if that's a cop out or not. I don't, trying to explain, yes, he's a counterintelligence threat, but no, that doesn't mean he's a spy since, 1987. It just means, yet again, he cannot put anybody's interests ahead of his own finances, ahead of his own egos. And in the world of spying, that's a horrible combination if that guy's on your side.
Peter, for you or for the audience, I would like to aim people towards an article I wrote in 2019 for Just Security called "Is Trump a Russian Agent?", which tries to lay out the terms and the explanations, which comes to that same conclusion. It's more of this gangster culture than it is he's likely a controlled asset of any foreign intelligence service.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and again for you two, because I know Russia, but you certainly know it very, very well. To what extent, while Trump has got this sort of gangster overlay in his businesses, when you look at what the Russian government has become in the age of the oligarchs post, fall of the wall, when you look at the rise and the people like Putin have been successful in the context of an oligarch economy and the way that sort of the processes of organized crime, Jerry, what you were saying about the unspoken sort of agreement and power structure, Putin came to power and has maintained power in that environment that is also in many ways very similar. And again, talking about an overlay of the overlay, you've got Trump who's existed in this organized crime sort of business criminal setting. And now you've got on the opposing side, this corrupt oligarch organized crime driven power structure. Again, they mesh very well. And it's, informal power channels. You don't need the resident coming out of the embassy here in Washington, D.C. to meet somebody in the Trump campaign. You can get somebody who is connected to an oligarch, who maybe was intel, Soloviki, maybe was, came out of Russian organized crime, but they can find a way to talk to a Michael Cohen and influence the levers of power there in the organized crime context that traditionally, back in the day, we wouldn't have seen. You'd be looking to cadre officers doing traditional intel work to try and find somebody and exert influence. So it's the entire process has been moved out of the sort of formal intel, counter intel channels and shoved into this global organized crime, internet transnational organized crime power structure that is working, unfortunately, really, really well, in my opinion.
Peter, I'd like you to come down a rabbit hole with me just for a minute or two, and then get your take on it. And so when I was on the inside, I know of an instance where there was a young agency officer, and he was posted to an authoritarian government, met a young woman, fell in love, and the way the agency works is that when an agency officer is going to marry a foreigner, she has to be polygraphed. And on her polygraph, she said, well, yeah, at one point in the dating process, as it was getting serious, the local service, the local intelligence service from this authoritarian government, which has close ties to Russia, came to her and didn't say, don't fuck with us, you need to work with us, but said, we would like to persuade you to talk to us from time to time, through a family member. We'll talk to your dad or cousin. He or she is willing to do it. And, from time to time, we can chat. And she said, she understood exactly what was going on. She lives in this. And she said, no. So she admitted, credibly, admitted this on the polygraph and said, like, I told him no, I understand. And the agency said, you know what? That we think this match is for real. They really love each other. But to the CIA officer, we said, you need to choose either to remain in the agency and not get married to this woman, or you need to leave because she will always be vulnerable, right? Her family members, 2 or 3 years from now, something will happen. So just set the stage. So in 1977, way back then, Donald Trump, a mogul, even then, real estate mogul, married, a Czech citizen, Czechoslovakia at the time. You're smiling, you know the story. Czechoslovakia at the time was a really hardcore, like the East German Stalinist government with a really hardcore intelligence service. Now, she was out of Czechoslovakia and she had committed an illegal act. She had entered into a sham marriage with an Austrian, Ivana did, and she had illegally emigrated with this, with this illegally gotten passport to Canada, and then she filled in forms to come to the United States that she filled in, illegally. She made claims that she had a valid Austrian passport, and she did not. And she met and married Donald Trump. Well, we do know from the Czech files left over from when the turn of the fall of the wall and so forth, that the Czech service, the STB, opened an investigation into her, that we know her father, who I understand informally was a hardcore communist, her father was talking to the Czech service, and that they opened an operational file, i.e., they had a specific operation in mind for this young, influential entrepreneur. That file has disappeared. That's never been found. So there is no smoking gun, and this is, this is conspiracy theory light, but in the counterintelligence world, that if I was the Czech service working closely with the Russians, I would probably use that to bump into Donald Trump, to have Ivana or her father, who was working with the Czech service, engineer a relationship, or bump somebody into him to just talk to. We can talk from time to time, perhaps, to begin this operation. And so I was just wondering, this is all real. I can't say that anything came out of it, but it underscores sometimes the long planning and the very different thought processes that communist services had at the time. I was wondering if you just sort of call me an idiot for bringing it up.
What you're mentioning, Jerry, is a failure of the FBI to investigate properly.
I think that's
this young woman,
that's where I was going.
Or was obviously there? I mean, that's the other, like, again,
All right, fair.
This is almost a conspiracy theory, but it's not, right? It's a sets of facts that lead to suspicion, is all it is. But what's your sense on that?
So look, one, my sense is, like, at least on the counterintelligence side, this is absolutely what the Soviets and Soviet client states would do, whether it is the Soviet. And in many cases, right. Like, if as good as the KGB was, the Stasi, these Germans were better, in my opinion. The Czechs were amazing. The Poles were very, very good. I mean, you look at the Warsaw Pact nations, the client states, they were, began because they were trained in part by the Soviets, but also they were smaller and a little, had competencies that, and a little bit less of the corruption that the KGB did. And so would absolutely do this kind of thing. And when it came to the immigrant communities in particular, leveraging those personnel who moved into the West, and whether it was immediately or just, you've got a huge field and you put out 1,000 seeds and you just watch which ones grow up, and you water them all religiously and you fertilize them all religiously. And all of a sudden one day you might need that radish, or you might need that stalk of corn, whatever it is you're just tending that. And to your point, Jerry, it isn't, no good intelligence service is going to, GRU, which tends to be stupid this way, they're not going to wield their power and influence like a blunt instrument. It is what you're not going to say something that is going to force somebody to an uncomfortable choice of either I'm in with you 100% or I'm going to walk away. You give people latitude and leeway so that whether consciously or subconsciously, they think they're okay, and you maintain that relationship. And so, again, going back to the earlier question about the counterintelligence investigation of Trump, without saying one way or the other, it is a reasonable question to ask because the Bureau had a vibrant counterintelligence program during the Cold War. They looked at emigres like this. Did anybody ever look at Ivana Trump? Did anybody look, if not her, the people that she was connected to who were in contact with the Czech services? Did anybody look at them? Is there any history? Well, that's one of the things you do if you had a counterintelligence case on Trump. You would go back and say, let's look at all these factors and see potential intersections between Soviet or Soviet client state intelligence services. And not only Trump, but anybody around him. And Ivana screams. I mean, it was a weird, like, if you go back and look at the timeline that's known about her movement to the West and the time she spent in Canada and what she did or didn't do and where this lied that I think Don Trump Jr. is saying, my mom was an Olympian. No, she was never an Olympian. Never. Never. And so where did that story come from? What was, the timing of her application for permanent residency in the United States, the data that was put down to support that permanent residency, whether there's sham marriages or not? All those are reasonable questions because those are techniques that were used by the Czechs, by the Poles, by the East Germans, by the Soviets to get immigrants into the United States. And, do you see the same players shepherding folks through like this? Who knows, right? I mean, reasonable question. The data is there to answer that question, affirmatively or not, but nobody's asking that question anymore. I'm willing to bet you nobody right now is digging through FBI files, doing a rigorous look at.
Or digging up in the golf club in New Jersey.
I think the answers might, and this is sort of, the answers might actually lay in files in Czechoslovakia that have been, or the Czech Republic that have been hidden, or more likely the operational file. The same with the Stasi files, the ones that were really important before the fall of those governments, they all went back to Moscow, right? So the Peter, I would gently push back on you on one point that you mentioned that we probably will never know, and that's probably true. But one hopes that, one fine day, a new Matrokin, someone with the jewels to the kingdom walks out with a file or two and says, here's what went down, or at least here's our version of what went down, right?
Yeah, but we're at a point now that even if that file comes out, people are going to disbelieve
Distrust
it, and
it.
it's going to create.
I know that's true. No,
and
okay.
Yeah, and I don't know. And
true.
so one, whether those would be destroyed forever. And then two, the other problem is, like, again, 30 years ago, I'd agree with you. But what I worry about now is, yes, somebody goes back into the residentura and the boss says, sit down and write this up and paper the file and make sure it gets there. Somebody, Kalimnik goes and visits with Deripaska and relays information. That isn't getting recorded anywhere. It's like, here's the polling data, word of mouth. We did this, pass on a plane or on my yacht. I do that. I relay it verbally. There is no file to be had. And that's the problem, is this professionalization of the intelligence process means that the traditional things that we would hope to see, and that you could sit there and say, oh, okay, I know that this person rotated back from, this office here in New Delhi and went back to, he was a line-in guy, so he went back to, director at S, and he would have known all these other people and had purview, and so I expect that he would be able to give me topics 1 through 5. Some oligarch who called on a favor? Who knows how to target that,
And
right?
there's no file to get, right?
We'll see.
Well, so I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I hope.
I don't think I am, but I just wanted to, I do want to. It doesn't really fit here, but it's like one of my favorite sort of KGB Russian long-term seeding operation stories, and it was so it was the killing of Trotsky, and Stalin wanted him dead, and there was a KGB officer who, and I'm not quite sure how she fit in, but she was a woman, which was very rare, living in Mexico, and she recruited, and I think he was only like 14 at the time. She recruited her son to do something great for the Soviet Union, to do something for Stalin. And this 14-year-old kid, 4 or 5 years later, is told to date someone that, and actually an American communist working for Trotsky when he was in Mexico City. And that gave him access, carrying, a block of ice, to get into his his compound in Mexico City to put an ice pick in his head. And so, this is, how far back do you go? This is a woman is recruited. She's got looking at her, 12, 13-year-old son thinking, I'm going to recruit him. I'm going to plant this seed because someday we're going to make this work. And it's a whole different mindset when you come from a totalitarian, authoritarian government society like that than what we live in here, right? I mean, that sort of thing would be almost unthinkable, except of course in the show The Americans, where maybe they recruit the daughter, right? But yeah, that long-term thing is something that we struggle to comprehend in our society.
Yeah, and so that example is what, over 100 years old, and take the experience of 100 years and apply it to a place like Mar-a-Lago and say, okay, if you wanted as a state to like get somebody on the inside.
Oh, it'd be impossible to get anybody in there.
Impossible. Nobody would ever, John. Nobody. No, you can never get to the ballroom.
Put on a tight dress, you can walk right in.
Yeah. A little plastic surgery.
Or a lot of plastic surgery.
A lot of plastic surgery. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Peter. What was it like to work with the CIA? Now, be honest.
Yeah. Were you in awe? I mean, how did you deal with that?
Like it was good. I mean, a lot of it was just over learning, and I grew up around the world and overseas. So I think, and then just through education, I think had a little bit of a different appreciation of what the CIA did and how they worked than the average bureau agent. And I think some of it is just overcoming some of it's cultural differences, but it's not even the cultural, it's just the procedures, right? I remember my agents getting frustrated because they would have some back and forth to somebody at headquarters and they'd give them different names. Now, of course, your listeners, but I don't know if your listeners know, you've got your true name and then you've got, potentially a cover name, which you might use if you're overseas, but then also internally you have a pseudo or a different name. So you all walk around with multiple different names, which all makes sense if you're on the inside because, every email's got, your funny name or whatever. But for an agent sitting there saying, well, I talked to John, but really he called himself Stormhammer. I don't know what the fuck that's all about. And so they're not trustable. And it's like, well, no.
I like that Stormhammer. I'm going to
use that's
that.
a good
Stormhammer.
pseudo.
I
wish I had one. John and I, our pseudos were pretty lame. Yeah.
Most of them are. Like I can count on one hand where I'm like, oh, that's badass. The others are like, what the fuck?
My first name was good.
There's
like Bart Simpson.
Well, the funny thing is that you get a first name, a middle initial that doesn't have a name, and then you get a weird name. And I remember this is in Nicaragua a long time ago, but they shot down an airplane. The Sandinistas did
at Hasenfuss.
It was Eugene J. Hasenfuss. And I'm like, that is a pseudo. That is not a real name. But it was his real name. But that's what pseudos sound like. Eugene J. Hasenfuss.
Yeah. But so setting aside that, and some of this depended on the officer, the biggest thing that aggravated me, and it was easy enough to like nip in the bud, and then you move up and people don't do it anymore. It was like occasionally you'd come across people that, in addition to working with you, would try to case officer you. And, again, you know what I mean by that. I don't know if your listeners do, but like, we are colleagues. I am not a recruitment target, right? So don't sit there and all of a sudden start launching into probe questions about, oh, when did you go to school? Oh, no kidding. What did you major in? Don't. I know what you're fucking doing. Stop asking me questions about myself.
That's a poor case officer, because every case
that
officer
that is a poor case officer, because like, yeah, John, you've been doing it to me for like 5 years now, and I have no fucking clue, right?
The best way to get an FBI officer is just pay for his food.
For travel or travel. Hey, we need to take you. We need to take you to the UK, and we'll pay for business class. Oh, whatever you want.
All right, I'm in.
Right. And just to underlay what you're saying, Peter, for the audience, when you use the word agent, even just basic terminology is different, right?
Yes.
So CIA, there are FBI agents, but CIA officers. We are never agents. In fact, that's a tell.
But then we call our sources
right, and you call your sources agents,
exactly,
so it gets all right.
If somebody says, "Oh, CIA agent," I was talking, it's like, yeah, they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's that thing from the Quentin Tarantino Inglourious Bastards, right? Where ordering beers and he holds up three and uses the wrong finger. Yes, that's exactly one of those things. That the minute you do, it's like, no, you're funny. But my experience was good. I mean, I think and then inevitably the little bureaucratic frictions of you've got a source that you're going to try and continue running because he came to the U.S. and it's not really clear he's going to be here for a long time. So maybe you don't tell the bureau because they're just going to fuck it all up because some agent in the middle of the Midwest doesn't know what the hell they're doing, and you're not going to risk blowing the source because somebody who's been working bank robberies their entire career doesn't know what they're doing and they're going to screw it all up. But other than those little things, I mean, the experience was generally good. But you all are much more politically attuned, I think, certainly at higher executive levels. I mean, the Bureau is good at covering their ass, but I think when it comes to operating within the halls of power, whether that is the White House, whether that is in the media, the ability of trying to drive what you are trying to say and do, whether that is with the president, now the DNI, or the president, whether that's with national security staff, whether that's with the national U.S. national security reporting apparatus, your ability to get your narrative out is way better than the FBI's. And in some ways, you know what? That's okay, because I don't want the people with guns that investigate people in the U.S. being savvy at the White House or the New York Times. I'd really rather be kind of square that way. But that also could lead to, when there's a policy disagreement, we're getting ready to go up to some deputy committee, getting ready for a principal committee meeting at the NSC, and you think you've got a good argument for your boss, and all of a sudden, DDO and the DCIA already have like all the bases covered and you're fucked before you walk in the door. Can be frustrating. But
about
that's,
the flip side of
that's
that,
at like
though,
the higher political level on the ground.
I worry a little bit about the flip side of that. We see from this Project 2025 and the MAGA people, and Trump has been very clear about they want to get rid of anybody who doesn't agree with them politically or partisanly. Is there a fear, and we can answer it separately about the agency, but is there a fear at the Bureau that, if it's made to be a partisan organization, is there a possibility there? Is there a possibility of FBI agents falling in and thinking they work more for MAGA than they do the United States?
And investigating people without predicates, going after enemies, that's a DOJ question as well. But yeah.
Yeah, so I think the Bureau, look, they're 13,500 agents roughly. I think it's very hard to, and most of them are good Americans who honor their oath they took. And I think it would be very hard to corrupt that entire group and say, go become, the brown shirts for Trump. I think, so I don't think you could do that organization-wide. I do think it would be comparatively easy to find a group of 50, 60, 70 investigators that you could bring into headquarters as a special under some MAGA SCSer and have them go do real bad things. Now, with a group that small, you can't target the entire American population, but you can fucking make life hell.
They come after me and you and
for the 51, however many intelligence officers, though you guys are fucked, but you can't. And so for the rest of the 13,300 agents who refuse to go along, well, fine, quit, in which case you're downsizing the FBI grade, or move them all to the border where they can work on, keeping out the rapists and the drug dealers. I do worry on the intel community side. First thing I'd do, if I'm Kash Patel or somebody, is go to the DNI and say, okay, I need you to give me a list of all the SESers, go into the clearance databases and let me know everybody who's an SES who has a security clearance. At the same time, I want you to go into FEC records and tell me, with this list, how many people have donated to Trump and how many people have ever donated to a Democrat. If you ever donated to a Democrat, your clearance is revoked. I have absolute authority as the president to do that. There is no recourse in court. Whatever you want to do, it's fine with the agency, but you don't have a clearance anymore. And then for the people who gave to Trump, well, here's my cadre, right? There's the new DCIA. There's the new DDO. There's the new DDI, or whatever they're calling the DDI these days. But then those become on the one hand, people you immediately move out to pasture, or the people you put in charge of those organizations. And thanks to our campaign finance laws, that's pretty transparent. And you could come up with a real quick list of, and make that, week one. That sends a message to your workforce.
That's quite a message. Ugh, scary times. But, we three are institutionalists, and we believe that we came from professional organizations who follow the Constitution and follow regulations and follow the law and try to support, whoever's in the White House to a certain level, unless it's craziness. And let's hope that continues to hold.
Yeah. I think it's also important, maybe just real quick to underline that Donald Trump is unique. We've never had any issues supporting any Republican or Democratic administration ever under any circumstances. It's just this one individual. It's not the Republican Party, but so much as the Trump. In fact, there are a lot of, I'd say a lot of agency officers are Republicans, but Trumpism is fundamentally different.
All right. So Peter, we've kept you long enough. Unless you have something you want to add, you want to hawk a book or anything?
No, amazing book on Donald Trump and the threat, counterintelligence threat
Nobody
he
read it. Yeah.
poses, compromised the counterintelligence and threat of
I
Donald
have it
Trump.
right. I have it right back here.
Written a couple of years ago, but a few years ago, but it's as true then as it is today. So,
Well, thank you very much for coming on with us. You're not only you're a good professional, but you're a good friend, and we hope we can have you on again sometime soon.
yeah, it would be great.
Yeah, tell us how great the agency is. I think we need to do a whole show on that, right? You know?
Yeah, it might be hard to sustain, but we'll see.
This is, both our charisma and our humility would have to be highlighted, right?
It's hard. It's hard to fuse those two, yet somehow you manage every day in and day out around the world,
good looks and charm,
pulling it
right?
off with panache and competence. Right?
Hey, one quick question: did you guys ever open a case on Jerry? Do you have anything?
Yeah, well,
Glomar. Have your audience go look up Glomar.